Hey guys, what is up and welcome to a new League of Legends video. I hope all of you did enjoy the top 5 assassin video that I put up a few days ago. But for this one I will be going over my top 5 AP mid laners for this current patch 4.18. Now I'm sure a lot of you do know that I do mainly play assassins, but playing AP mids is something that I also do quite frequently, just because sometimes assassins are not the best pick, because assassins are very high risk, high reward, while mages bring a lot more CC, they bring more wave clear and range in their abilities, and overall just are safer of a pick. So if you're a player that either wants to sometimes play these AP mids or you only play AP mids, here are my top 5 for solo queue that I personally will pick in order from best to worst. And in the number 5 spot is going to be Twisted Fate. This is a champion that I personally really enjoy playing for quite some time. And a cool thing about Twisted Fate is that by a lot of pro players, a lot of them do say that Twisted Fate is quite honestly the quintessence of mid lane, especially when it comes to mechanics. Because the mechanics required to play Twisted Fate and the amount of attention that you need to put into this champion to play him to perfection, or at least to a certain degree, is extremely important to be able to do in order to even play the mid lane properly and even play all the other champions within that lane as well. So a lot of pro players do look at this champion as one of those champions that you just have to know how to play and be able to play to a certain degree if you want to play mid lane. But the pros I have listed for TF is the fact that he tends to be somewhat of a mobile mage, because personally I always run move speed quints on him. And you can always be running around while selecting your W to go for the stun, the slow, the mana, and you can always throw your Q very quickly and continue on with the movement and the kiting or chasing. And his ultimate of course gives him huge mobility. One of the main things that I love about Twisted Fate is that his Q, unlike something like an Ezreal ultimate, does full damage to every single unit that it passes through, rather than decreasing in damage per unit passed to a certain extent. And with that being said, his Q is also one of the best wave clears in the game because again, it does full damage to everything it hits. And the range on it is quite nice. Like I mentioned earlier, his ultimate gives him huge mobility, which is great for solo queue games because being able to go from one lane to another in just a matter of seconds and just simply turn around what could have potentially been a bad thing for your top, your bottom, or your jungler into a good thing. And believe it or not, that small play you just made with Twisted Fate because of your ultimate can be the deciding factor as to how your team will snowball into the game and just simply win. His passive gives him a lot of extra gold while you're farming, which is always good for solo queue, and on top of that, he has a lot of options with his W, mana, slow with AoE, or a single stun. And being able to have options on champions is always a good thing. The cons of Twisted Fate is that of course, like I said, he can be somewhat difficult to play as he does require a certain level of mechanics to play properly. He also can be somewhat vulnerable because he has no form of dashing, nor does he have any way to increase his move speed, just from his kit, which is why a lot of people tend to run Flash Ghost on Twisted Fate. And he can be slightly weak in the early game because he doesn't have a huge amount of damage, especially when compared to a lot of other mid laners. But overall, a very deserved spot for Twisted Fate. In the number 4 spot is going to be a champion that I don't think I've included in many of my lists. But she is someone I'm finally really happy to include because she's the closest thing to an assassin of all the mages. I still do consider her as more of a mage rather than an assassin, just in case some people are wondering why I put her here. But let's go into the pros that I have listed. So the first thing is the fact that she has insane mobility for a caster, if not the highest, because of her ultimate. And this is really what gives her the assassin sort of feel as a mage. This thing can be very useful to just simply dodge abilities, get in and out of fights, while doing somewhat decent AoE damage. Next is that she has a decent wave clear, not the best, nowhere near as good as Twisted Fate, because the range on her Q is a lot shorter than Twisted Fate's, which means that she has to be somewhat close in order to clear the whole wave, which, if your enemy team is sieging, can be somewhat of a dangerous thing to do. However, her charm is one of the best things to catch off people, because the range on it is quite nice, you get them to move closer to you for a few seconds, and her damage is amplified on that target, which is the perfect way for her to follow up for the kill. Then you have her passive, which will give her HP back whenever she uses a spell at times. This can be really useful for the laning phase because it gives her some much needed sustain, since compared to most casters, she is somewhat of a close range caster. And this small burst of heal can be the difference between you living and dying in a very close and tight teamfight or duel. And finally, a huge thing about Ahri is the fact that her Q on the return does true damage. This makes it really nice to harass enemy champions with, and is one of the reasons as to why she has quite a bit of burst damage. The cons of Ahri is that she is somewhat reliant on her charm in order to land her Q both times. And on top of that, they nerfed her spells a few patches ago to do less damage overall, but more damage if she does land the charm. So if you do miss it, that also means that you missed a lot of your damage. Her W's range is quite subpar and does require her to be somewhat close to her your enemy opponent to land it. Which goes into the next con, not the longest ranged spells. Like I said earlier, and especially compared to all of the other mages I have listed here, she is somewhat required to be fairly close to her target in order to get most of her damage off. But overall, definitely a well-deserved number 4 spot for the damage that she can output, especially if you land the charm, plus huge mobility, which a lot of mages do not have. In the number 3 spot, I'm going to be putting a champion that is arguably one of the best, most consistent mid laners in the game for a very long time. For several patches, Orianna has always been a top contender for mid lane, while many other champions have been moving up or down. And this is mainly why I put her in the number 3 spot, because she's always good, but she's never the best. There's always one or maybe two champions that are just better picks, but Orianna is one of those champs where you honestly could just never go wrong with her. So the pros of Orianna is the fact that she has extremely solid zoning potential in the laning phase with her ball, because you just put it on the enemy caster minions and you just let it chill there. And whenever the enemy opponent goes in for the CS, you simply move the ball with your QW, auto attack potentially, and you have so much harass going, and it makes them somewhat scared to try and CS. So with that being said, she has a very solid laning phase, which is why I said you can never really go wrong with Orianna. It's hard for her to lose, because there's really nothing that hard counters her. Then you have her ultimate, which is one of the best ultimates I think that a mage can ask for. You can put the ball on someone and ult off of them when they initiate, like a Rengar, huge AoE damage, pulls them all in, and then you slow them with your W. Amazing ultimate, amazing utility. And speaking of utility, she has a lot of support for her allies. She can put the ball on them, which gives them the shield. She can use her W to give her allies extra move speed and or slow the enemy team from moving forward or running away. And just overall has an amazing kit with great damage while also providing a lot of great utility. And the fact that her ultimate is an AoE CC ability rather than just one target makes it a huge plus. And there's also so much synergy with Orianna and other champions. For instance, Rengar, Malphite, Jarvan, Wukong, and so many more. Her abilities have very low cooldown, especially her Q, which you can honestly just constantly spam over and over again. And speaking of her Q, it's also very nice to use to check certain areas like a brush and just places where you simply do not have vision of. And finally, she has a pretty good passive which helps her in the laning phase and scales somewhat decently. The cons of Orianna is that you have to really understand her ball's range, so that you know when you can use the Q and at what point you can stand away from it before it comes back to you. And related to that, you also have to be able to keep track of the ball. In a big team fight, when a ball is kind of just sitting around, it can be hard for you to remember where it is last, or especially if you put it on a target that decides to rush into the fight. A lot of Orianna players make the mistake of thinking the ball is still onto that target, so they press the ultimate, but the ball actually went back onto Orianna because that target simply went too far, and they completely missed the ultimate. And the final thing, which is kind of a small con, is the fact that her ultimate has a slight delay, which makes it somewhat easy to miss as well, because people can dodge it, flash it, or you can just miss it yourself. But overall, a very deserved spot. The number 2 spot is going to be featuring Syndra, who's been making a huge name for herself recently in the competitive scene and also in solo queue. And the reason is because she has one of the strongest laning phases in the game, just because she can use her Q while she's moving, which is extremely huge in terms of being able to harass in the laning phase. And also makes it somewhat easy for her to kite in a team fight because she can use the Q while moving backwards. Next, you have her E combined with a Q, which makes her have a huge range on her stun, probably one of the longest stun ranges in the game. And if you hit multiple people with it, they're stunned there for a very long time. And especially if you use your ultimate first and then your E in a team fight, you have so many balls that will fly through the enemy team with so many chances to stun. Then you have the amazing, crazy, terrifying damage of her ultimate, which is quite honestly the nightmare of ADCs, and even most mid laners. Then you have the low cooldown on her spells, especially her Q, which makes her pretty bursty. And her W is so useful because it has so many options on what you can use it on, while also providing a pretty impressive slow. The cons of this champion is that she has no innate escapes. I mean, she does have a pushback and or a stun, but sometimes that cannot be enough. Her QE stun can also be a little difficult to land if you're not used to it. And finally, managing her Q to utilize her ultimate's full damage can also be a little difficult because you can do the ultimate too soon and not really get off the damage you could have. But definitely a solo Q stomper, and you really want to pick her up if you want to just simply destroy your games. And finally, in the number 1 spot is not going to be Zed. In fact, it's going to be Xerath. I just had to put Zed footage in the background because Xerath is still disabled and I cannot get any background footage of him, since obviously no one is able to play him, and the queue time on the PvE right now is just way too long. So let's just pretend what you're seeing right now in the background in the game is actually Xerath. But nevertheless, Xerath is my number 1 pick because I just think he's just an amazing mage. The first thing I want to say is that he was, if you remember, my number 1 underrated AP mid a long time ago, and now he's a contender for one of the best. So I actually ended up predicting that pretty well. The reason that Xerath is so good is because he has insane poke and range on his abilities, and the cooldown on them is also quite low. But that is probably the biggest point. The amount of poke that he can dish out is just unmatchable. His stun is also not the hardest thing to land, and if you land it at anywhere near the max range, it will stun them for such a long time, which is a very nice way to pick people off. His W also has a huge amount of damage potential, especially if you land it in the center, which you should if you land your stun, while having very nice poke potential in the laning phase, because even if you miss from the center and you land on the sides, it'll still apply the slow, which in turn should make it easy for you to land your Q. Then you have his passive, which some people really think is not that good, but I think it's amazing. Because he is a champion where you want to spam your spells on, especially for the poke, and this passive makes this easy to do, especially in the laning phase where the mana regen is somewhat lacking. And finally, I've said this throughout many times, but he has very low cooldown, especially on his Q, which again is one of the reasons as to why Xerath is just the best when it comes to poking. The cons of this champion is that of course he is purely skill shot oriented. Every single ability, especially his ultimate, is a skill shot. And with that being said, his ultimate can be somewhat awkward and difficult to land. And the last thing is that, again, like Syndra, he has no innate escapes, no dashes, nothing like that, but he does have a slow with his W and a pretty decent stun. But again, like Syndra, sometimes that just may not be enough. But Xerath is definitely my number 1 pick for solo queue, and I just think he's the best mage right now, with Syndra being at a very close second and Orianna at a very close third. But that's it for this video, guys. I really hope you did enjoy it and maybe learned a thing or two. I highly recommend picking up all these champions and really learning Twisted Fate, because again, he is something that you really just need to know how to play mechanically if you want to play mid lane up to a certain point, and being able to play him well will honestly just increase your overall mechanics, so definitely give it a go. But again, I really hope you guys enjoyed this one, maybe learned a thing or two, share it with your friends, throw in a like if you did enjoy it, and for the next one I'll probably make a top 5 underrated AP mids video. So definitely look forward to that, and I'd also appreciate it if you guys could follow me on my Facebook and Twitter fan page, both Redmercy LOL. But with all that being said, I hope you guys really did enjoy this, learn something new, and I hope to see you for the next video. Peace.